Hello, everybody. I'm very happy to announce that we are going to have this wonderful occasion to discuss about inequality, mobility, and global risk. And thank you all being here. We welcome you. My name is Dale Kim from Seoul National University, and we are I'm one of the organizers of the conference in summer school on inequality and mobility. And again, I thank you all being here. Okay, the inequality is some inevitable outcome of free market system and viewed by many as a negative aspect of the capitalist economy, but it is also a very important incentive to motivate people for economic growth and improvement in welfare. In that sense, inequality is an opportunity that everybody has to be able to exploit or utilize to invest in human capital, to be more productive and make some higher income, and we usually call it mobility. But otherwise, at the absence of such mobilities, or when these opportunities are unequally distributed among people, individual gaps and inequality are likely to be widened and they become permanent. And this weakens social cohesion and sometimes hinders economic growth. So today we get together here to discuss the inequality and mobility issues in various social dimensions, and also we discuss about policy implications, and also review the issues in global context as well as in a local context. For today's presentation and panel discussion, we invited renowned economists from around the world and also from Korea. Let me first introduce Professor Seok-Chul Hong from Seoul National University, and he's giving a talk about the Korea situation, and he's now serving as a chief economist of Presidential Committee on Aging Society and Population Policy. And we have 4 panelists from around the world, and first, let me introduce Professor Stephen Dolloff from University of Chicago. And he's a Stens Professor in Education Policy in the Harris School of Public Policy at the University of Chicago. And he's also serving as a director of the Stone Center on Wealth Inequality and Mobility. Would you please just stand up and wave hands to everybody? Okay, thank you. And next we have Professor Jessica Pan from National University of Singapore. And she's been working on gender issues and also family issues, and she has published very influential papers recently about female labor supply and family issues. Would you please? Okay, thank you. Now we have Professor Gregorio Caetano. Did I pronounce your name correctly? Okay. He's from University of Georgia, and actually he's been offering certain new angle, or sometimes maybe I should call it an innovative angle to look at these inequality issues. He's been working on segregation and sorting based on individual choice, and he's been also publishing many papers on these issues. Okay. Thank you. And lastly, we have Professor Jin Young Kim from Korea University. Yeah, he's over there, and he's working on intergenerational mobility, occupational mobility, and education. And he's also published a lot of papers on these issues. Thank you. Okay, then we'll first start with the case of Korea, which is facing big challenges from low fertility and aging society. Please welcome Professor Seok-Chul Hong for his presentation. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you for the Professor Dale Kim preparing for this nice conference and important the round table. I'm Seok-Chul Hong at Seoul National University. I recently left school for a while and currently working on planning and coordinating the national policies at the Presidential Committee on the Aging Society and the Population Policies. Today I'm going to give a presentation on the topic of the population crisis and deepening inequality, focusing on Korea. But the main event for today's meeting is a panel discussion. So I will summarize the many issues for the panel discussion rather than presenting the result of academic research. So I started my PhD at the University of Chicago in 2002 and majored in economic history related to the health and population under the guidance of the late Professor Robert Fogel. So maybe because of influence of my advisor, I have been very interested in seeing the social issues from the long-term perspective. So I will start with the long-term trend of population. This figure on this slide shows long-term trend in the fertile trade across countries in the from the 18th centuries. So in the case of United States, we observe a declining trend in fertile trade from throughout the 19th century and the 20th century. But what stands out is that the fertile trade experienced a rapid decline during the period of the industrialization, especially throughout the 19th century. But the slowed down after industrialization was established, especially in the late 20th century. But if we shift our attention to the more recent trend from 1970, so we can observe the significant change here in the birth rate of some countries like Korea, China, and Mexico, especially before 2000, when the industrialization took place in those countries. However, the slowed down after then. On the other hand, when we look at the other countries, United States, Japan, and the OECD countries, there the trend is very gradual compared with the Korea, China, and Mexico. So these observations shed light on the relationship between the demographic changes and industrialization. The countries have experienced different patterns of decline depending on their stage of industrialization. So the following figure shows the rate of population aging in each region of the world since 1950. It is quite fascinating to observe the countries that have already undergone industrialization in the early 20th century, such as Europe, North America. They are now encountering very surge in the population aging in the late 20th centuries. So, however, the other countries like the Latin America or Asian countries, African countries, the population aging level is lower than the other countries. So economists have suggested many of the theories to explain the decline in the birth rate and the acceleration of population aging since the advent of industrialization. So following those theories, I will explore underlying factors that are contributing to long-term demographic changes. So I think at the heart of this transformation are women and the concept of care. So demand of care consumed a portion of our lives, requiring the financial resources and the time investment. So in the pre-industrialization, the care was primarily the responsibility of families. Especially the cost of care was generally covered by the labor of men, and the women consumed their time to fulfill the family care duties. So additionally, care was based on an intergenerational, the family care system, so where the parents care for their children, and in turn, the children support their aging the parents. So there was a high incentive to have a large number of children in that time. However, with the onset of industrialization, substantial changes began. So as women became the primary source for workforce because of industrialization, so the opportunity cost of caring their families increased a lot. And as women's educational attainment increased, and technologies such as home appliance and the contraceptive, the progressed, and the widespread, the women's opportunity cost for women found themselves free from the housework, and their opportunity cost associated with marriage, the pregnancy, and the child caring increasing. So this caused a substantial decline in the fertility rates. So moreover, the advance in the medical technology and successful eradication of disease due to industrialization have significantly increased average life expectancy. So the period of care for elderly prolonged a lot, but intergenerational family system has weakened over time due to the decline in the number of children being born. On the flip side, we have witnessed a notable increase in the government responsibility for the caregiving. So in many developed countries, they have implemented comprehensive social security systems throughout the 20th century. So their main role in the caring responsibility is how they pool the country's available resources and how to allocate and redistribute these resources for carers, especially for the cost and the time needed to support the care system. However, the gaps often arise in this process of redistribution of resources throughout taxation and social insurance among different socioeconomic status groups and the genders and generations. So this led to coming of inequality as outcomes. So such a demographic change following industrialization is noticeable in Korea. Just last year, so if you look at this left-hand side, the graph, the Korea's total fertility rate hit a record low of 0.78, so making it the lowest in the world. Back in 1970, when industrializations just beginning in Korea, the total fertility rate was 4.53, which was very similar to the rate seen in the United States at the end of 19th centuries. So since then, the birth rate drastically declined, and especially from 2015, the situation has become more concerning in Korea. So in Korea, starting from 2010, so what happens? The rate of women entering colleges surpassed that of men, and women's active participation in the workplace was growing very fast throughout the 2010. However, the social norm, the culture, and the policies in Korea did not adequately adapt to these changes. So as a result, around 2015, we observed the deepening the gender conflict, and there is a substantial shift in attitude toward the marriage and the childbirth in Korea. In addition, along with industrialization, Korea achieved very successful disease eradication, and we established world-class national health insurance system. So as a result, the proportion of the elderly population has increased very fast. And the trend of ultra-low birth rate accelerates this pattern, the trend of population aging. At present, the proportion of the old population, aged 65 or older, is around 17.5%. However, the prediction indicates that the rate is expected to be reached about nearly half of the population by 2070. So this would make Korea the oldest country in the world in terms of population aging. So moreover, South Korea is now facing a shrinking society as the number of deaths exceeded number of births. So this has resulted in decline in the total population from 2021. So the population of Korea now is approximately 52 million. However, the predictions indicate by the year of 2070, it is estimated to decrease to 38 million. So this significant reduction in the population poses many implications and considerations for the country's future. So these demographic changes are generating the many kinds of economic and social consequences. I will highlight the most important impact that economists has more concerned about. The one is a decline in the potential growth rate. Another is increase in the old age dependency rate. So regarding the decline of total population, the more the pressing issue is working age population is shrinking by approximately 300,000 to 500,000 every year in Korea. So this trend raises serious concern that South Korea's the growth rate will drop below 1% within next decade. So many experts worry that South Korea might be heading down a similar path to Japan. Another impact is rapid increase in the proportion of the elderly population. So this lead a significant rise in the old age dependency ratio. So this places a substantial burdens on the working age population. So from economic perspective, a large share of national resource will need to be allocated to support the elderly population rather than the spending for production and the consumption. So economic consequence of demographic change can serve as a significant increase pathway leading to increase in inequality. So we can identify the various pathways in which demographic crisis can contribute to inequality, but among them I will talk about the 5 main issues. The first, the demographic change can have a profound impact on the labor market, potentially resulting in increase in inequality. A shrinking working age population poses the challenge for the labor market, leading to shortage of skilled workers. So this drives up the demand for skilled or the productivity workers. So the competition of jobs intensifies, so potentially result in the lower wage for some the working groups. So this dynamic can increase income inequality by widening the skilled wage premium, and so the hindering the social mobility. Korea serves a representative example where the shortage of skilled personnel in some field of the first, the industrial revolution, such as semiconductors, the situation is getting serious. So as you can see from here, they compared between the 2021 and next 10 years. So it increased, the supply-demand gap increasing over time. So it can cause a the wage premium in the future and leading to the increase in inequality and hindering social mobility. The second issue is old age, the support. The right-hand side graph shows the long-term predicted trend in the old age dependency, the ratio across the countries. So if you look at the numbers, the Korea and the United States, their number, the ratio are very similar at this time. However, the predictions indicate that the gap between those ratios will widen in the future. Especially by the year of 2070, it is expected that Korea will have the highest old age dependency ratio in the world. So this increase in the old age dependency ratio implies more resources will be allocated to support the elderly population. So the burden on working age population regarding Social Security, including the national pension and the health insurance, will increase. On the other hand, there may be relative insufficiency of social spending on the human capital investment like education. So many experts concerned that these changes can create a challenge for vulnerable groups with a lower socioeconomic status and potentially hindering the social mobility. So demographic changes also increase the risk of intergenerational inequalities. So typically the societies and society wealth and the government support is generally concentrated on more on the elderly populations. In the case of Korea, so as people become old, there is a higher proportions of their wealth is tied up in the real asset like real estate. However, rather than the financial asset. So recently, with the rise in the real estate price, the net wealth of elderly has increased here. However, younger generations has experienced significant increase in debt, so leading to a widening and wealth gap between generations in the previous 10 years. So moreover, older generation often to prefer to pass their accumulated asset to their children rather than consuming them for their life. So this can impede social mobility and further deepen inequality within the society. And also, I would like to talk about the gender inequality regarding the population issues. But the gender issue has two kinds of perspectives. The first, if a sufficient foundation for work-life balance for women is not established, the gender gap in economic activities may widen. So in the case of Korea, there exists a significant wage gap between men and women compared with other developed countries. So it can be argued that compared with other countries, Korea lacks a robust the culture and the policy, the framework to support work-life balance, so which is crucial for addressing the low fertility rate in Korea. So when the foundation of work-life balance is insufficient, the women often experience their career break due to the marriage and the childbirth and the child carings. So as a result, we observed the M-shaped, the pattern where women's participation in economic activities is declined during the child rearing periods. So if you look at the right-hand side graph, there is the graphs. The gray one is observed in 2003, and the red one observed in 2023. So there was some changes over time. So this is good news. There is recent indication of Korea to gradually moving away from this M shape, so which can be seen as a positive the development. So if a country implement effective work-life balance policies and undergoes positive social and cultural changes to become more family-friendly, the gender inequality can be significantly reduced. So this is the last one. So many countries have responded to decline in population and the decrease in the working age population by expanding the immigration policies. So in the case of Korea, the ratio of foreign workers to population is very low. So if you look at this graph, the proportion of population born abroad is about only 2% in Korea. It's very low compared with other developed countries. It's very similar to Japan. However, the Korea has accepted significant foreign workers in industries facing the labor shortages. So if you look at the right-hand side graph, there is increased foreign workers, but there is the slowdown during the period of the COVID-19, but it has been increasing very fast, especially regarding preparing for the shrinking society and the decline in the working age populations. There is considerable discussion in Korea about how to expand the comprehensive immigration policies. But it is crucial to consider the experience of developed countries that have previously expanded their immigration over time. So immigrants often face challenges in securing employment, and they are more vulnerable to discrimination. And many have limited educational opportunity because of the language barriers and the lack of the government support. So inequality between immigrants and native populations can widen, potentially leading to social conflict and problems. So in conclusions, I have briefly examined the trend and the underlying factors of long-term demographic change, as well as the impact of demographic change on inequality from some perspective. So I eagerly anticipate further insightful discussion at the panel discussion. So this is the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Seok-Chul Hwang, for a nice presentation, and very appreciate it. And he talked about low fertility and aging and its association with the greater inequality in Korea. But low fertility is just an outcome of many other causes. And so, one of the more fundamental issues might be the gender equity, for example. So please let me start with you, Jessica. Okay. So in Korea, women are currently being asked to work more and also have more babies. They're asked to do some impossible combination of two conflicting tasks. Okay. So, but I think the gender equity is one of those rare sort of solution to this problem. So, from your research experience, what can you say about gender equity and this fertility and all other family-related issues? Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Dale and Professor Cho, for the wonderful and interesting presentation. So I think one thing to note, I think this issue of low fertility is something that is also very close to my heart. It's a big issue in Korea. It's also a very big issue in Japan. It's also a very big issue in Singapore. And I think all of these governments are, collectively kind of at this point where, they are in some way kind of running out of, ideas on how to actually fix this issue. I cannot say I know the answer to this, and I think if I did, I would have a lot to contribute in this area, given that this is, a very first order issue. I think there are certain sets of ideas that have been circulating around, which I think does hold some truth. I think if you look at cross-country patterns in countries that are grappling with issues of low fertility, it turns out that actually East Asian countries aren't the only ones. If you actually look very carefully, Southern Europe in some way actually also has a bit of a fertility problem. Italians are also not having kids. And one thing that seems to be characterized by many of these countries with low fertility is indeed these somewhat more traditional or less progressive gender norms. And I think when you kind of start to think about the interaction between women's opportunities and gender norms, you kind of get at this like somewhat catch-22 kind of situation. So on the one hand, I think it seems to suggest that we have to think about ways in which we can make parenthood more, to put it bluntly, more attractive to both men and women. Sometimes it makes it seem a little bit like it's the women that are the ones that are in this very difficult situation, but it really kind of takes two to clap. So I think on the one hand, we have to think about how to promote more marriages, and conditional on marriage, how to promote them to have more kids. So I give you an example. At least in Singapore in the past, 10 years ago, they used to think, if we can just get enough people married, the kids will come. Okay, and that used to really be the case. They had very active policies that would actually identify single men and women within government institutions and force them to actually, not force, but strongly suggest them to, associate in social settings to create these, unions. And the thought was really that, most people, once they are married, they want to have kids. And in fact, they don't just want to have one kid, they typically want to have two. But today, actually, the data speaks very differently. It seems like getting people to get married is not enough, because many of them will, get married but choose not to have children, or if they have kids, they just, decide to stop at one. So the problem seems to be, both on the extensive margin as well as the intensive margin. And the question is why? So I think one set of things are to do with norms. I also want to put another explanation out there, which I do think, may be also related to topics on inequality as well as the social structure and the way education is also organized. But I do think that one of the big issues in many of these countries that seem to be a consistent theme is really the notion that getting into a good college or investing in education is extremely important. It makes me think also that the same factors that have made these economies very successful, right, this drive for education, this drive for economic success, might be the same set of reasons that is also making it difficult for this generation to think about if we were to produce a child and to make them also successful, or at least as good as where I am today. It's also very challenging and time-consuming. So I think with that, I wanted to pass it along to my other panelists to see their thoughts on this issue.
Thanks a lot. It's I was planning to the direct question to Greg, but I have to follow up with Jessica first. So you mentioned about education and the cost of education. For example, if you want to make your kids equally successful and as costly in terms of time and money. So actually, that seems to be a very important question for us at the moment in Korea. And do you know anything about the private tutoring situation in Korea? Is it, what about in Singapore and other countries? How expensive, how costly is it to make this fertility problem become one of the major issues of the economy? Would you believe?
Yeah, so I think just very briefly, I think we got a pretty good sense of the private tutoring industry in Korea being something that parents feel like they have to invest in. And alongside this, I think there are other indicators, right? The fact that you feel that you have to put in a lot more time, both mom and dad have to put in more time. I think in Singapore it's similar. I think there's always a sense in which just having just going to regular school is insufficient. You do have to augment on many other dimensions. I mean, there's some examples of policies that I think have tried in ways to try to make the education system more open, but in ways that maybe potentially make this sort of like these other things perhaps even more competitive. So I give you an example. So I think one way in which Singapore was a bit worried about the fact that, you know, getting into university was very reliant on grades. What they did instead was they started to try to come up with alternative pathways and alternative ways of getting in. So you could show proficiency, for example, in math and science. You could show proficiency maybe in sports, proficiency in maybe arts. But then that led to another arms race, which is then a lot of tutoring on like these non-academic aspects, right? So you suddenly see a lot more classes in horse riding, a lot more classes in tennis, a lot more classes in cello playing, because, you know, parents naturally try to game the system. And I think this is one of those things where policy interacts also, because again, the notion here is that it's competitive to get in. There is a clear sense of like what it means to be successful in the education system, and it's very highly valued by almost everyone in the population. So I think there is something similar going on, maybe not just with private tutoring, but I think in many different aspects of, what makes, someone excel in education, broadly speaking. Yeah.
Thank you. This is a topic that cannot be, resolved in over 2 hours. But I'll get back to with this question to you, and maybe later to Seok-Chul and, Jin Young. But at the moment, I'll have to jump to Greg. Okay. Gender itself is you cannot really choose your own gender, right? But you can choose your attitude towards gender equity and issues. And, I'm afraid that we have some rivalry between feminism and anti-feminism in Korea, mainly arising from the lack of jobs in the local labor markets for young people. And, that could be thought of as some sort of some certain form of segregation, and this is just one example. So what I like to do is just to direct you some more general questions, like what is the role that segregation and sorting play on inequality, and especially in recent years? Would you please elaborate on that? Thank you.
Yes, I think segregation, like I've been explaining in the lecture that we just had, is very connected to different aspects of inequality, because you can always understand as the segregation is a manifestation of inequality because different people make different choices. A particular aspect that might generate a lot of inequality, and as Jessica was mentioning, it can have a major effect in also fertility, will be gender norms, which could be understood as a manifestation that tends to evolve via some form of segregation, or some different choices and some different notions of identity that form different groups of people, like in the case of people more in favor of feminist values, others less in favor of feminist values. But related to also this notion of segregation, I would like to point out that there are always, almost by definition, there are always going to be some form of minorities. There are some form of people that are going to be less likely to be heard. And whenever you see manifestations that tend to go out of the ordinary, like the case of fertility perhaps in Korea, it's a good thing usually to think about, okay, who is the decision maker in that situation, or who is more likely to have bargaining power in the decision maker relative to other kinds of decisions, which in this case tend to be women are more likely to have bargaining power there, not relative to demand, but versus other instances in other decisions. And it's a good thing to think about perhaps serving them to understand what exactly is that it is making them less likely to be inclined to have kids. One aspect related to all those things that Jessica was saying is that indeed the condition of women could be related to that. But I would like to point out a second kind of unheard voice throughout this process here, which is young people and kids. So parents supposedly anticipate the amount of happiness these kids will have in their lives before they decide to have kids. And it's also important to understand that it's possible that these parents are not anticipating these kids, perhaps because of the reason, the competition culture that we were discussing before. They might not be anticipating the kids to have to the present value of the happiness overall in their lives to be so high. And this could indeed affect their fertility rate as well. And again, these are all manifestations of unheard voices that whenever you see a possibility of seeing them act, because by definition they might have some kind of bargaining power, it's a good thing to hear.
Again, the follow-up question. Okay. I had a chance to look at the data in Korea during the period of COVID-19, pandemic. We had this one of the social distancing policies in Korea. It was to stop students from going to schools. So we looked at, and actually that social distancing policy increased the sort of childcare burden to the family, and we looked at who is going to take care of the children. Okay, let me ask you this: what do you think the portion of the child care givers, the portion of fathers as a new child care givers, out of this after the social distancing policy? What do you think the share of the fathers in that category in Korea in 2020?
I don't know. I would guess it has increased since COVID, but it's still low.
Zero.
Yeah.
It was zero.
Yeah.
Well, not zero, but below 1%.
Yeah.
So, okay. Do you think it's, is it, well, it's just, that I may be, unfair to ask you this question, but do you think it is a result of sort of optimal choice based on, market opportunities, differential market opportunities among, fathers and mothers, or it is just a gender norm? Or, and what if it is a gender norm? I mean, so how can you sort of correct that kind of bias in gender norm if it is a gender norm? Okay.
I think it's very difficult for me to answer this specific question in the context of Korea. In general, we do know that gender norms about that are incredibly effective in making changes of that caliber to just not happen. I would say, though, that there's always the possibility that market conditions might be at play here, that it's possible that because of assortative matching, it's possible that marriage tends to happen, like highly educated women are more likely to marry highly educated men, and highly educated men have a high return of education. Because of higher education, they might decide to work because it's valuable for the family to work. One thing that I would add to the discussion that we're having about tutoring, so I have a paper showing that enrichment activities, because every hour you spend doing some enrichment activities, by definition, you must be spending one less hour of something. It can have a negative effect, and at least using data in the United States and also data from Australia, we have shown that it has negative effects on non-cognitive skills, which could be part of that story I was telling before, that could, like, as any would-be mother and any would-be father, it's important to understand that they are, in principle, they could be rational beings that could anticipate that those kids might, in the future, had they decide to have a kid, they could suffer from the competition culture.
Thank you. We'll get back to the point later. Okay. Now I'll have to talk to Steve. Okay. So actually, you have done a lot of researches about almost every aspect of the economics. But I have to at this moment confine my question to educational policy first. So the U.S. education policy is much different from ours. But anyway, one nice aspect about U.S. Education system is it's market-based. At the same time, it has a lot of experiments so far. So how would you sort of evaluate the educational policy, the educational system, the U.S., in terms of inequality or gender equity, and also there has been recent ruling about this against this affirmative action for the minorities, in college admission. So, as a whole, how do you evaluate your policy or education system in terms of inequality and mobility?
Well, it's naturally an extremely difficult question to answer because there's many dimensions to admire and many dimensions to be deeply concerned about. So in the spirit of skepticism or constructive criticism, let me talk about some of the dimensions which are of contemporary concern. So one issue in the United States, or one dimension of the education system that distinguishes it, I believe, from Korea, is the role of local public finance. So the United States is broken up into thousands of school districts, and a substantial amount of the revenue that is generated for education between ages 5 and 17 are determined at the school district level. Now, states provide assistance as well, the federal government does as well, but nevertheless, the upshot is there are very substantial disparities in the amount spent per student according to the accident of birth and location because of the school districts. I think in thinking about that, the numbers in fact understate the degrees of disparity because of the fact that many schools are located in disadvantaged, dangerous neighborhoods. So much of the expenditure has to be done for things such as guardianship. If you have to put in metal detectors in a school, or you need to have guards, et cetera, that detracts from the traditional educational mission. So one thing I would put on the table is, in thinking about educational inequality in the United States, is the need to rectify these types of disparities, which are an artifice of the decentralized nature of the American system. And so I think Korea absolutely should be commended for having something that's done at the national level. So I wanted to say, I think a second thing to think about, and this is a case where the U.S. exhibits creativity, but creativity also can create dangers, is what you refer to as the heterogeneity of the types of schools that are offered. There's a very vibrant private school structure in the United States. Some of the schools are religious, but many are not. There is also a fair amount of flexibility that exists within school districts to create what are called charter schools, in which individuals, subject to regulation, can set up an alternative school to the standard public school. Other districts or locations, you have what are called magnet schools, where a city will invest in a particular new school, trying to make it a very high quality and hence be a magnet to bring people together. So, experimentation, flexibility, all of those generate information that can be very valuable for improving education. When I said there's a danger and a caveat, I want to allude to what back to Greg's ideas, which is that in thinking about educational systems and the fact that you have per pupil disparities, et cetera, one must always ask the question about segregation. In other words, whether children from different socioeconomic backgrounds, from different ethnicities, are being segregated into schools of differing qualities and having different opportunities generated. So I think in any assessment of the American flexibility, you need to ask the other question, which is to what extent is that flexibility generating types of segregation which inhibit intergenerational mobility. The third thing I would say is that, to my ears as an American, the natural answer to worries about demography is immigration. So something the United States is unusually successful at is the flow of people throughout the world coming to the United States. Now, with reference to education, I would make 2 points. The first is one way to have successful immigration is to have schools that are designed or explicitly attempting to make the children of immigrants welcome. And so I think that with reference to Korea, the question there is how do you design, if you wish to increase immigration, how do you create institutional mechanisms that ensure that the children of the immigrants are quickly being integrated into the regular public schools and benefiting from the outstanding schools in the country? Let me add parenthetically that when you raise the issue of kind of discrimination, social adjustment, et cetera, those are obviously universal issues. When I say that America does great at immigration, that coexists with a lot of discrimination and very difficult trajectories for people when they arrive there. And so there's certainly obviously scope for policy. I will note that there is one universal feature of immigration in the United States, but it's not because it's America, it's because it's human beings, and that is the children of immigrants always learn the community language. So there is no sense in which the children of immigrants will not be speaking Korean as long as they are not residentially segregated or in schools where nobody speaks Korean. And so that would be, I would emphasize that because if you said, well, one of the issues is children of immigrants are currently not learning Korean, I think there is a remedy to that. We know as a universal regularity, children learn the community language, not their parents' language. And so that's a statement again about integration. And so I talked a little bit too much. I know you want to ask about affirmative action, so let me stop there. So affirmative action is one of the classes of policies that are efforts to essentially do what I've called in other writings associational redistribution. In other words, to think about redistributive policy not in terms of the taxing and transferring of income, but rather to transfer who interacts with who. And the policies are explicitly designed to promote the diversity of institutions, obviously, and in particular, to promote the presence of historically disadvantaged groups in society. And so affirmative action is, I think, well understood to have had substantial benefits directly to those that receive opportunities because of it. And you say for the obvious reason, they receive the opportunities. But a second thing affirmative action does that's very important is it has spillover effects. So one classic example has to do with statistical discrimination. People have stereotypes about groups they haven't interacted with. And so the process of integration is a way of breaking those stereotypes. There's extremely interesting research done by Conrad Miller at Berkeley, who found the following. The temporary affirmative action orders at firms led to persistent increases in the hiring of African Americans. Now, this is not a causal study in the way in which economists talk about causality, but it's a corroborative study. In other words, there's a vision of what could happen. You don't have any African American employees. You have certain stereotypes about black workers. Affirmative action is implemented. You now have information. You update the stereotypes. You realize there's no fundamental differences. And so even if the requirement isn't there, you still have persistent increases in hiring. So I put all of that on the table as to say that I think that the affirmative action policies are one of the important mechanisms that exist in the United States to address what I think is properly thought of as the original sin of the country, which is the treatment of African Americans. There are also affirmative action policies historically for women. In other words, there's a whole set of issues of gender discrimination, issues of role models, of gender norms, et cetera, exist in the United States just like anywhere else. And so historically, that's something that mattered. It turns out in 2023, the group that needs affirmative action is white males. There's huge disparities emerging in the education of men and women. So things change over time, and obviously for Hispanic children, there's also arguments that they are facing different types of disadvantage, different types of discrimination. Again, I don't want to say every group falls into the same category. So, but I would say quite collectively, if one thinks about groups, there's an important role for affirmative action policies. As a result, what I would say with reference to the Supreme Court decision, which is going to essentially ban affirmative action as conventionally done, I would say two things. The first is, to be blunt, Harvard was guilty and on the narrow case should have lost because there was discrimination in my judgment against Asian American applicants. The reason I say that is that what was happening in the admissions process is the Asian applicants were probably this is known from your newspapers, were being given very low personality scores by alumni interviewers. And that was creating disparities in the admissions rate, and it's evident that that was a meaningless construct. So if the court had just ruled on that, I would say they should have said that that was discrimination. The problem is that they then moved, because it's a very conservative court and a radical court in terms of its willingness to violate precedent, to engage in a wholesale ban of the policy. So it's going to it's creating an uproar as we speak in American academics. Now, what you will see is that the universities there will think through ways to have de facto affirmative action without having explicit race conditioning. But then it will go back to court, and there'll be a whole set of cases that say that you can't do that de facto as well as by rule. And so I'm demoralized by it because I think it's going to hurt the status of people of color.
Any sort of cross comment or ask questions to Steve? Jessica or Greg? Yep.
Yes. One thing that Steve mentioned, which is one particular motivation for affirmative action, which I think that this is in part why I'm also a little bit disheartened about the decision recently, is that perhaps we need to study more the exact reason why affirmative action could indeed solve problems like the ones we're talking about right now. And I have presented a paper this week exactly that tries to make this point about if you increase the rate of hiring of, say, women in a specific occupation, gender norms will likely change in that occupation, and these will become more attractive for other women to go there in that particular occupation. And that is particularly important now, going back to the idea of college. Mentorship matters a lot, and particularly if you're talking about STEM fields, mentorship, it's really like, this is happening in the United States, this is happening here as well. There are not enough women that are engineers. And when we see a lot of people who sort to engineering majors, you see them disproportionately being men. One question that comes to mind is, how would it be different, after all, when mentorship usually happens within gender lines? So you usually think about yourself like, how would I look like 20 years from now? How would I look like? And they see themselves based on the same gender oftentimes in terms of identity. So if you see most faculty being men, who do you think is going to sort towards that major? All those things have important connections, and my hope is that that paper that I was discussing exactly has the goal is of trying to provide a little bit more what we call micro foundations towards an actual better argument towards affirmative action, not quite on the perspective of only fairness, but actually on the perspective of even efficiency. It is a good thing. There are some people out there that would only be, there are some ideas out there that only certain people with certain kinds of experiences could ever have. And diversity matters a lot for us to touch those ideas. And if we don't have that kind of diversity, how we have the kind of innovation that we all want?
So I guess if I might make two comments about, which I wanted to add to what Jessica and Greg said. One of them had to do with gender norms, and it's something that may be useful to think about is the distinction between norms that are internal versus external. In other words, one thing to say that I don't think that women should work. It's a different thing to say I think other people in my society don't think women should work, and therefore my wife ought not to work because I will, people will look down upon me. Now, that's not just hypothetical, because actually there was a remarkable paper written by Leo Burstein and co-authors that found the following, which is what they did is they offered essentially free job placement to a group of Saudi women, and then they polled them. I'm not going to do justice to the study, but in essence what it said was they communicated to the husbands of these women the attitudes of the other husbands about whether they intrinsically thought their wives should not work. And what they found was that in fact, people had exaggerated views about the hostility to work amongst other men. And so after they found out that they were, in fact, there was not such a universal hostility in their among other Saudi men, their willingness for their wives to go through this job placement process to create opportunities went up. And so I think that it was properly said, the idea, changing social norms, we don't have good theories about that, but we may have good theories about the distinction between those things that are external versus internal, and external ones may have something to do with information. The second thing I wanted to say had to do with the issue you brought up about the competitiveness of universities. One framework for thinking about that is something that I've been pursuing in work with Yusun, among others, is to think about the idea of bottlenecks. In other words, that societies have these paths by which people flow through to success, and there may be certain locations it's just really hard to get through. Well, an easy example of that is an elite university. And so if you have a system that has one or two extremely elite universities, that is a profound bottleneck. And that leads to the question, is there any way to open the bottleneck? And so I actually asked Dial a question the first day we were here, and that is, had the entering class at Seoul National University increased in the last several decades? And you thought the answer was no, which is unusual since the population of the country went up. So for a trivial reason, you have more people, it means you have more people that are of outstanding ability, but this bottleneck is not increasing. And so that's an example, but I would actually make a more sustained argument that one issue in educational systems, which of course interacts with the extremely high altruism of Korean parents, is that if there are very few slots and hence these bottlenecks are hard to get through, that's a huge disincentive to have more than one child. But if you open the bottlenecks, there's more scope for people's investments to be efficacious. And so one way I would say that is, but I'd say the same thing with the United States. The United States needs more University of California Berkeleys and fewer University of Chicagos. Berkeley is a gigantic university, produces just as many Nobel Prizes and brilliant people as anybody else, but it isn't a bottleneck the same way the elite institutions are. I know I've antagonized my Chicago graduates on the panel.
One quick comment is that the Korea government, especially Department of Education, is in total control of the enrollment of the universities. They decide how many students we can get, and they are not willing to lose their power at all at this point. So that's the kind of a difficulty we have in Korean universities. And coming to your immigration issue, can I have one comment? One thing I really admire is about the American society is this openness, immigration, and finally Koreans are now coming to the stage that where we should think about opening our country to have more immigration. And one thing kind of we have as a big problem in terms of this immigration policy is that unlike the US, so far we were trying to open only to the basically low-skilled workers because these small manufacturing firms which didn't have much kind of supply of the low-skilled workers because Koreans have moved up the stage, I think, for a while. So there are very low supply of low-skilled workers, and so government is just trying to accommodate their needs and let some low-skilled workers to migrate. But that's the only kind of a policy we have implemented so far. So I really hope that we should try to get more the skilled human capital so that we can have the externalities you were talking about and all the benefits associated with that. So that's just...
Actually, I was going to ask exactly the same question to you, but you answered it even without hearing any question from me. But actually, I'll get back to the point because this competitiveness in education system are one of the problems we have in Korea. And I have a little bit of statistics on my hands, and for example, I'm talking about the private tutoring here. And the most recent survey said that 80% of school kids have taken private tutoring. Private tutoring in the private market is not really common in the US, right? It's mostly the Asia-specific factors in the private tutoring. So it's like the school's not teaching enough, so we are sending our kids to private tutors for additional learning. But anyway, 80% of the school kids have taken it, and on average, 40,000 won they are paying per month per kids. 40,000 won is about $300, and in total, $173 million, which is in 2022, which is 1.2% of GDP. So this is one of the major industries in Korea, and if we stop them, then we are going to have a lot of unemployed people. That will be another problem to our economy. But anyway, this is really bottleneck and a sign of competitiveness kind of thing. So I'll ask, do you mind, Jessica? Okay, I'll ask this problem to Jessica first, and then I'll get back to Seok-cheol and also Jin-young.
Great, thank you. No, I think the points raised about the bottlenecks in education as well as gender norms, I think they're both very interesting points. Maybe before I comment a little bit about the idea of bottlenecks and competition in education, I just wanted to react very quickly to Stephen's point about norms. And I think I thought the example of this notion of internal and external norms that he raised, I think is a very important one. I think, even beyond just gender norms, I think it applies to also when we try to think about how do we really shift this idea of maybe, say, trying to encourage more men to be willing to take on, paternity leave, to do more housework, right? So ultimately, it seems to be very intricately tied to this kind of conundrum. And I think the notion of norms here actually very much also interacts with the entire work culture. Right, and so I've always found it really interesting that in Japan, and I think to some extent in Korea also, actually legislation regarding paternity leave is actually very generous in that, but the people taking up is extremely low. Right, so people are very reluctant to take it because they think that if they do, somehow they might miss up on job opportunities, or that somehow it might actually affect their career progression. So these are very real sort of, individual considerations about one's career that make it sort of very difficult to kind of break out that mold. And so related to this notion of affirmative action that we talked about, and this exposure to sort of diversity and counter-stereotypical examples, I think these are really situations where really if the government is very serious about trying to shift this norm, or companies sort of agree that somehow productivity isn't sacrificed and maybe even enhanced by having workers be able to exercise these options, you really have to have situations where you show people that by doing it, you are not hurt. So for example, the example of the Japanese minister who actually took paternity leave, was a very powerful one because it showed that if your boss does it, it means that you can also do it. And I think you need more of these examples to sort of really walk the talk rather than this very vague notion of like, oh, guys, you should just like do, you should just, like change the norm, right? So I think breaking it down into very specific things that can be achieved that maybe require some sort of coordination across maybe big companies or even with examples from the government, I think is extremely critical to trying to shift a norm. And the beautiful thing about norms is that it really has dynamics, right? So a small group of people do it, it doesn't shift a norm. But a small group of people doing it might trigger a slightly larger group of people doing it, who will trigger a slightly larger group of people doing it, and then very quickly then it sort of could tip over. Right, and so the problem, and so that's one issue with norms, and I think it also helps us to kind of reduce the problem to something that one might be able to make some progress on, right? Okay, so that's one thought. Now coming back to competition, I think this is again it's a question that's very near and dear to my heart. In part because the Singapore education system is similar to the Korean one. There, I think our bottleneck is actually not so much at the elite college stage because I think the government has a very clear plan on what proportion goes to university. That could be scattered across a few universities that are supposedly more or less on equal standing. But the bottleneck in our case actually, which I think it represents a clear bottleneck, is that we track very early. And given that parents are very altruistic and they care a lot about inputs into the production function, they worry a lot about the peers that their children are around. So there's, as long as you put in something where they have to be tracked and depending on whether or not they achieve a grade, they are able to go to a particular school, it starts again this notion of competition, right? So I really appreciate this notion of a bottleneck, and I do think that identifying where the competition is very intense and really sort of thinking very seriously about the counterfactual. Like, if we were to release this bottleneck, would it really be the case that parents will find that it is much easier to raise children, much less stressful. I'm sure that Dale didn't talk about this, but I think alongside all these private tutoring costs, the stress on children must be immense. And I think that there is really this growing sense that we might be shortchanging our students, our children, because you worry about their mental health, right? So I think that these are real concerns, and I think at some point needs to be some collective action. Yeah.
Jessica's comment and also the comments of Greg and Steve, even though they are not living in Korea, it's like they know very much about Korean situation. So, okay, as a chief economist in charge of these fertility issues and the gender norm issues, what do you think about this bottleneck stories and competitiveness problem? Sukjal, would you please?
Yeah, I totally agree with the bottleneck, the issues, competition in Korea. Maybe it is because of the limited supply of the university and the educational opportunity. But I think the Korean case is a little bit different with the other countries' case. I think it's more related with the labor market, the situations. Because in the labor market, the Koreans, the wage difference is more depends on the kinds of companies. So there is a huge substantial disparity in the wage between the small and the medium-sized companies and the large corporations. And the job performance is the matters in increasing their own wages. So in terms of incentive for education for the children, they would like to send their children to the prestigious university to secure the high-income jobs in the future. So it is very natural incentives. But it is not easy to eliminate the private tutoring entirely is not reasonable in Korea. And I think the fixing the structure in the labor market might be more important to resolve these issues. So in the committees, so we are every day talking about the policies, how to fix the structure in the labor market. Especially, we would like to make the job performance is more important in the wage determinant rather than their educational attainment or their the background. The educational cost is one of the main cause of the low fertility rate in Korea. The problem is the level of private education is quite depends on the parents' socioeconomic status. Is getting more serious over time. So if it is not connected with the parents' socioeconomic status, I think it may not be a problem, but because their connections, it is become more serious in Korea. So I think the bottleneck, the issues that can be resolved through the labor market and the disconnection between the private education and the parents' socioeconomic status. So I have one question for the U.S. We are worried about the increasing the private tutoring and the private institution, the cost in Korea. But according to my brother, he's living in the LA. Every day when I talked with him, he worried about his daughter's education because the many parents, American parents, want to send their children to the private school, expensive school, to get admission to the prestigious university. So the cost of the private tutoring in Korea seems to be very similar with the cost for sending the expensive private the high school in the U.S. How about the case of the U.S.?
I think it's a good analogy, but it also says something about the concentration of the privilege. In other words, there's a fixed number of elite private schools, so very few people get that extremely intense investment, whereas the numbers you gave with for the entire nation, where it's 1.2% of GDP, that's spread out over many, many, many people. I mean, if we were going to go down a more philosophical direction, and you ask me a question, do I actually think that private schools are a healthy thing? I would say no. In other words, that the private schools in the United States, and I'm saying something wild in terms of something socially undesirable. I think that the case of the elite, educationally elite ones, they do create enormous inequities, and it's both a direct fact that parents can segregate their children into these extraordinarily good schools. But second, once you decouple the aristocracy, as it were, from the public school system, that kills their support for the public school system. And so I think it's extremely important that you both don't have the segregation and the political consequence that people are no longer, quote unquote, in it together. So I think if anything, so the issue here to me is distinct, but I would emphasize that it's a more diffuse type of inequality than you have in the American case.
So may I mention another part of the cost, like Jessica was mentioning before, is the mental health issues, because surely there is this financial cost that we're considering, but so using American data, what I have shown in a paper is exactly that there is a causal effect of enrichment activities, exactly these kinds of activities that we're talking about, on non-cognitive skills, which is the mental health issues, and this is only concentrated to high school kids. It doesn't happen in elementary school kids, it does not happen in middle school kids. It's just high school. And more importantly, it is happening only for high income and middle income families. It is not happening for low income families. That's what we're finding. And I think this goes back to the idea that about what are the unheard voices. So it's perhaps possible that one of the unheard voices will be the teenagers that are put in a position that they have very little control because it's an unknown world that they are still learning how to navigate, and parents are trying to do the best they can in that situation, but it's also possible that if you were a rational parent, you might decide to reduce fertility rate if you see that world.
So I think if we're going down the philosophical route, I also have a philosophical thought. So, you know, I think my view on all of this is in some way that, you know, life is going to sort people eventually. You know, people get sorted. It's just the way things are. The question is just when you sort them, right? So even if you have a system with, you know, not so many bottlenecks, people appear in the labor market, you're going to figure out who is more productive and then who's others, and the market's going to reward that. That part we cannot change. You know, we're not going down into a society where we want to pay everyone the same. So at some point, employers have to figure out who's productive and who's not, and you know, you have to rely on the skills that you have in order to showcase your productivity. Now, the question is, are we going to link these productivity measures to some sort of signal prior to that to make employers' jobs supposedly easier in some form of a statistical discrimination kind of fashion, right? And I think when we talk about bottlenecks here and we talk about elite colleges, that's essentially with the function of what those institutions do, right? It's almost like bringing the competition, or rather the sorting game, right, that life is going to have anyway, earlier and earlier and earlier, right? So, and the issue here comes in that when certain groups of people are able to have or feel that they have control over the system to confer some advantages in order to get there, right? And again, you know, people are altruistic. They want what's best for their offspring. It's literally, and maybe it's also related to because that's the only thing they can control, right? You can't control other things. You can only control your own children. So you try your best to kind of confer the advantages that you have to them. And essentially by doing that, I think what ends up happening is that, you know, we are sort of getting into a situation where even if you fix the labor market, it's precisely because the labor market's relying on those signals that, you know, you sort of still end up in this problem that, you know, of inequality with people trying to do what they think is best in order to try to kind of beat the sorting game. So, you know, bring us back like 20 or 30 years ago when, you know, in fact, no one is to say that because you went through all that tutoring, you went to the top elite college, that you are probably a better, worker, better researcher, a better entrepreneur than somebody in a different system who hadn't actually been sorted in that very particular fashion. So in some sense, there is something where it feels a bit like it's a rat race. There is this kind of overinvestment in a particular dimension of skill, which is what people are being sorted on, which may or may not be very strongly correlated with what makes somebody eventually actually a very good worker. And I think that's sort of the conundrum I feel that in some societies with very sort of fixed pathways to success, you sort of end up in this very tight bind where if you deviate from that course, then the penalties are potentially very severe. So I think that's my philosophical rant, sorry.
I'll get back to the original plan, but anyway, before going there, I like to ask Jin Young, you can't be idle there, right? Okay, so and actually, there was a talk about segregation, and this is very important in Korea in some sense. With the prestigious or elite colleges in Korea, we talk about when we talk about this elite colleges in Korea, we talk about connections and networks, and it's like, it's very important for you to know the government officials for if you do the business and the kind of stuff, right? How do you assess that? Sort of see that in terms of inequality and mobility. But sometimes we say that we're putting the similar guys together, even though it is a segregation. It is sometimes productive in educational output functions. But I don't know whether it's just true or not. But people say that. So can you sort of put those things together and sort of evaluate the system?
Can I get to that question a little later? Let me talk a little about the kind of a Korean situation first, my assessment of it, and then I'll get back to the Korean education system in a little bit. So here's the things I found in terms of the inequality and social mobility in Korea right now. In inequality issue, if you look at the Gini coefficient, so that is just a snapshot of the economy at the one point of time, and look at the distribution of the income, Korea is very equal. One of the lowest in Gini among almost 40 OECD countries. So that's good. Well, I'm not trying to have any kind of value judgment, but the story is a little different if you look at the social mobility. I had a similar study which I presented the other day with the Korean data, and there I looked at the occupational mobility in Korea. And if you look at the early cohorts, the occupation mobility among Korean old cohorts was almost like 5 times higher than the US. So the distance between the fathers and sons, the occupational difference was huge. So it confirms to my kind of an idea that the in old days in Korea, the social mobility was quite high. But if you look at more recent numbers, I looked up the papers published probably after 2010. The intergenerational income mobility, income elasticity is almost the same as the U.S., about 0.3, 0.4. And if you look at some other measures, one measure I came up with is the this World Economic Forum publishes the some kind of a global social mobility index. And in that index, Korea was around the 30th among 40 OECD countries in terms of the social mobility level. So things have changed. That was my assessment that in terms of social mobility, the Korea was very mobile, but not any longer. So what happened? Well, I don't have a really complete understanding of this, but my guess at this point is that the educational system. I agree with the Dale that the once our education system was kind of important ladder for the social mobility. Now it works almost against it. So that's kind of my assessment. There are a couple of reasons why I think that way. One is that the government involvement. At this point, if you look at the government involvement in the education system, especially the tertiary education, it is really ridiculous. One number which kind of was surprising to me was that in the last couple of years, high school students received more funds from the government than the college student in Korea. I thought that it was a mistake or something, so I rechecked it and it was correct. So high school student is getting more from the government than the college student in Korea now. That's very depressing. And on top of that, you know, as Dale mentioned, there is a huge burden on families for the private tutoring. And another fact is that the educational mobility among Korean families is very high, actually. So well-educated parents beget well-educated children, and that correlation is quite high now. So more resourceful families are now spending a lot because government is not spending, so a lot on the college entrance, and that makes the more severe kind of immobile society, I think, in Korea now. So I do think that we should do something about Korean education system, at least shifting the focus on more tertiary education, and the details I'm not sure at this point. I need to think about a little more, or maybe do some more research. But at least the direction is that's what I felt. So, did I answer your question vaguely?
Yeah, but actually pretty much answered my question. But do you have anything to add? Okay, at the moment, all right. I'm going to put the hold on this education issue because we've been speaking too much about this. Okay, and we have a $2 million questions right now, very important questions. So 31 minutes may not be enough for that. The first question is, okay, the text-rich has been a convenient answer to this inequality issue. So how would you assess that kind of approach to inequality issue? Usually we talk about education, especially in recent days, we talked a lot about this early intervention for the kids, especially the disadvantaged kids, and they'll improve their educational outcome and their future earnings kind of thing. But along that line, that is one line, but there are these famous economists, insisting this text-rich policies. Thomas Piketty and Emilio Saez are those leaders in this front. How do you think about it? I'll start with Steve, if you don't mind.
Well, I think it's a little bit country specific. The U.S. has very low taxes, so it's hard not to make an argument that one facet of a more egalitarian society is going to involve a more progressive tax system. That said, I guess in my mind, the issue is not in isolation having a more progressive tax system, which of course changes after tax incomes, but what you do with the money. And so if you were to ask what would be my laundry list of policies I think are important for promoting equality, you've named the first example, which would be early, there's very strong evidence that intense, good, high-quality early childhood investments can help disadvantaged children. I think that I would put that on the table. I think there's also now, even after many years of controversy, very strong evidence that higher per pupil expenditures in elementary school improve outcomes, and so that's another place where absolutely I would place resources. But then I would go beyond that to some extent to make arguments that that maybe 21st century redistribution does have to do with interactions, with memberships, with what I call associational redistribution. And so to me, there has to be very explicit efforts to try to promote various types of socioeconomic integration with full understanding of a key point that Jessica and Greg mentioned, which is it sounds wonderful to say we're going to promote this, 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 and this, but we also have parents that are going to pursue what's best for their children. And frankly, we want parents to do that. What sort of horrible society would it be if we did not have those powerful emotions and sources of personal satisfaction? And that similarly, segregation can reemerge at different scales. So keeping in mind those are two fundamental constraints to things. Nevertheless, I think there's very good arguments for thinking about ways you can go down those dimensions. I've already indicated my support for affirmative action policies as one example, and I consider what I call the relaxation of bottlenecks an example of promoting integration because it delimits the extent of what an elite is. There is no there's no law of physics that requires that school districts be drawn the way they are in the United States, which are facilitating economic segregation. And so one can think about even very fine-grained policies. What are the zoning laws in terms of the construction of houses in a school district? The most common zoning restriction, which is a regulation in the United States, is a ban on multifamily dwellings. Translated into English, that means there's no apartment buildings. And so you can go through a whole set of types of policies, all of which are designed to try to create enhanced levels of integration. And so in my view, that's probably a frontier of redistributive policy that taxes provide the resources for, but progressive taxes are not the end in themselves.
One of them is it's not just the tax. What matters is how you spend the money in terms of redistributive, motives, right? So, anybody suggest certain policies or it's the good way of spending the tax money to improve inequality?
I fully agree with what Steve said. In terms of policy for increasing that, I would like to mention something. We just spoke about the fact that the mobility, the intergenerational mobility between father and sons are particularly high in Korea, but I wonder if the inequality that we see between men and women in Korea could be at play here in terms of the intergenerational mobility, because from the perspective of the decision maker, I'm talking about the effect of infertility. From the perspective of the decision maker, who are the father and the mother, the would-be father and the mother, they have no control whether they're going to have a son or a daughter. So it's possible that the intergenerational mobility that we've been measuring, which happens to be extremely high in Korea, might be high conditional on the person being born, being a man. And to the extent that you need to average them out, you need to think about the expected value, and to the extent that perhaps from the perspective of the girl who is going to be born, maybe income and earnings might not be the best metric for their welfare because of those issues that we've been discussing. A potential concern would be that this would have an implication on it would have implication on the fertility. So I would in terms of policies, going back to the idea of policy, I would absolutely invest on things that would increase the equality of opportunities for at the gender level, particularly in not only in the education but in things that usually would affect norms, like for instance, I would increase the notion of bottleneck. I think it could be important. It's possible that the problem about bottleneck in higher end institutions is that social norms tend to collapse inside institutions, and then there may not be enough of a diffuse option in terms of social norms for everybody to feel safe in the environments. And if there are just too few environments, there wouldn't be enough space for women. So I would definitely invest on that.
If you look at this as sort of rate of college advancing rate, by gender in Korea and the U.S., actually the share of women going to college is higher than the share of men, boys going to college. So in that regards, it looks like we are not really discriminating against the daughters, but the usual our perception is actually somewhat different from that numbers, right? So how can you explain that, or do you have any idea about in Korea we have a high rate of college advancing rate among the daughter women, but still we are known for this male chauvinistic country. There's a big gap in practice and perception in Korea? Do you think?
So I think you summarized it very well. I think in some sense that's the conundrum, right? It's that on the education front, I think very much in line with the country being and I think again several other countries are in a similar situation. They very actively promote both men and women getting a lot of education, and I think I think actually today my understanding is that I think in terms of sex selection or even gender preference, I think even in Korea it's come down a lot. I think Korean families or Asian families, they are very happy when they have daughters, and in fact the flight from marriage might be precisely because they find themselves in that conundrum, right? Better to not get married probably than to get married and be in a bad marriage, and I wouldn't be surprised if some very altruistic fathers are precisely telling their daughters that, right? As much as I would like you to get married, if you cannot find someone who can support your career and your own aspirations, perhaps it might be better. Maybe they don't say it, right? They still say, I would prefer you get married, but in their minds, they're thinking that, right? But children kind of internalize that and they can make choices these days. You're not in a situation where parents can compel their children, like in the past, to actually enter unions, right? So I think it's a manifestation of the issue. I think when we think about there being kind of gender norms, it does seem to play out differently in terms of education. And sort of what happens in the household and what might be expected. Ideally, these things track each other, and I think historically they have tracked each other, and then now it appears to have diverged. And I think that's exactly where the flight from marriage kind of originates. It's this particular bottleneck. Seems to be a theme here, but this is a different bottleneck where the aspirations and the the reality doesn't seem to quite match up so well. Yeah.
So I will add that the United States has exactly the same thing. In other words, college attendance has become more and more disproportionately among women versus men. Part of it, and if you look at things such as test scores, the gap between men and women, really boys and girls, we're talking about pretty young people, has been increasing. An issue in the United States that distinguishes it from Korea, and this is part why I was surprised when I saw the data that was presented, was that there is a general disillusionment emerging among many people in the United States with the value of education. So and perhaps not surprisingly, there's been a lot of social exchange in the United States, a lot of downward relative mobility as well as upward mobility. It's good downward mobility. If you create opportunities for women and people of color, somebody else's relative status is not going to be preserved. But the upshot is that the belief in college and the construction of aspirations for college and one's children seems to have deteriorated, and it seems to be an essential part of the story in the United States. And so I'm puzzled simply because Korea is exhibiting so much growth and seeing so many successes in the last several decades. To still have that gap emerging suggests something, I don't know the explanation, but quite interesting.
Okay, related to this gender norm or gender equity or anything related to this gender issues, I cannot help asking this question. Okay, technological progress. The AI is now, everybody's talking about AI. Anyway, this technological progress, do you think would it help to reduce the gap, the gender gap, or our perception about gender norm kind of thing? Because people saying that the technological progress have been favored, female workers against, rather than male workers. Then, will that sort of change our perception about gender norm, or in practice, a gender gap?
So I think it's a bit of a challenging issue, because I think on the one hand, to the extent that there could be some technological progress that might favor women, again, it's another aspect where women's economic opportunities shift, and then the question is whether the norms can catch up. So I think technological progress on its own, it's not super clear to me exactly how it would directly change norms in a sense. We might even be able to think of some examples. I had very nice chats with students, all of yesterday, where I think there might be a concern that, with different forms of technological progress, it might, end up being sort of, maybe a substitute for companionship. It could, perhaps maybe even, make it, more difficult to kind of not conform with what existing social norms might be. So I think it's a very difficult question. I think, again, it's always hard to predict the future. I think on the works front, there seems to be some indications that, maybe also related to the disillusion of men, and, the fact that, at least in, certain countries, it does appear that, for whatever reason, men's education levels have either stagnated or maybe even regressed. That the technological shocks might be even more challenging for them. But I think in my mind, the gender norms issue is one that's a little bit distinct, but one that needs to catch up, because all these forms of technological progress would make the norms even more costly to society as a whole. And I think in some way, sort of, women and men opting out of marriage because it seems like the opportunity costs are very high, might be actually sort of made even more severe. Yeah.
I thought Jessica brought up a really important point, which is that there may be gender-specific differences in the abilities to adapt to disruptions. I mean, the classic example is Russia after 1991, where men, to be blunt, fell apart. Life expectancy went down 8 years, and it's an incomprehensible thing in terms of lost generation. And so, one factor may simply be that there is for whatever reason, different abilities to adapt to disruptions. Maybe one thing I would add to that, which is worth thinking about, is that there's evidence in the American case that as the role of personality traits has become more important in labor markets, that the disparity in the personality measures between men and women has been a mechanism that helped reduce the gender gap in wages. And so Sarah Katan at University College London, her dissertation was on exactly that topic. And it's not obvious to me that AI won't diminish the personality traits more than the cognitive skills, because after all, if you have all these, if everything can be done virtually, somehow some of these interactions that seem to be maybe less important. Final thing I was going to add, just for this may have something to do with immigration too, which is one dimension of artificial intelligence is it may lower the barriers of not knowing a language. Now, I don't want to quite say we're going to go to Star Trek with the universal translator, but the serious point is, if you think about translation programs, where they are now versus 10 years ago, it's extraordinary. And so it would not shock me if the next generation allows for interactions between people who don't speak the same language at a qualitatively different level than we currently have.
I was told that the two most dangerous jobs. There's two most dangerous jobs now: the lawyers with the AI danger, AI, and the foreign language teachers.
So one thing I will mention is that as the potential uncertainty about the outcomes of new technology grow, it's increasingly more likely that the actual minorities that we should be worried about are not going to be mentioned today because we don't know them. The losers, we just don't know who they are. And they are going to be losers, typically. So the question is that whom? So I think policymakers should be aware of the fragility of the capability of understanding ex ante who is going to be the loser, and therefore figure out policies that help ex ante, again, the resiliency of people, to empower people to respond endogenously to whatever shock they are going to receive. And because it will oftentimes takes too long for people at the top, people who are actual policymakers, to be aware about who those minorities are. Oftentimes, minorities don't have voice. They are very well heard.
Yeah, it seems like the situation has been summarized very well. And then, well, we are running out of time, so I cannot help this, coming back to the last question I have. Okay. Inequality is a matter of income gap, not just between people, but also sometimes between, countries, among ethnicities. So, economic imbalance across countries is an important risk factor, so sometimes lead to serious conflicts across countries. And the inequality within countries is not necessarily a problem confined to the country either, because we have witnessed in the 20th century that this public discontent about inequality has easily led to the admiration of socialism and also imperialism, and which led to some the revolutions and war. So this is a sort of not exactly academic question, but this is a I'd like to ask, what is your assessment of the seriousness of this inequality issue as a risk factor to our society and, in some sense, to the global society? I'll start with the Korean representatives here. So, okay.
Well, gender, I haven't thought about, so that I was a little hesitant. But the inequality, I think, and its impact on and the social kind of stability, I do think it has a huge impact. The political changes in the U.S. and as well as in Korea in the last decade or so, I think is due, in my opinion, it is due to the changes in inequality. The unstable kind of a market and labor market, or the increasing disparities. I think that made people more diverged in terms of their opinions, with the help of this new media technology. I think that's a difference, I think, which made this kind of change more kind of vivid in the last decade, I think. And so economic cost of having an unequal society, I think it is enormous in my opinion. And so it is not just a philosophical problem, but also a very practical economical problem, because Korea, I think, has lost a lot in terms of this political conflicts in the last decade. So that's my thought.
Can you add something?
Yeah. I think the history can give some lessons for us at this time. If you look at the long times ago, during the Industrial Revolution, in the 18th, 19th century in the Europe, there was the huge inequalities began, not only in the underdeveloped countries, but also in the developed countries, especially in the Britons. So among the many theories that supported socialism in the early 20th centuries, many research began to look into the issues in the UK. So one example is Engels. His work that look at the working class disparity in London during the industrial revolutions. So rather than the economic imbalance among countries, I think the domestic inequality is more important. So in the early 20th centuries, many of the developed countries, they have own inequality issues. So these make people less trust the governance or the public systems, so it can make the political instabilities. So after each country suffered from that kind of issues, I think that there was the groups that support socialism emerged from each countries, and that they tied up and make the global risk with the trigger events in the early 20th centuries. So from the lesson of the history, I think that currently the advanced country, they have own inequality issues and domestic issues, and the underdeveloped countries, they have own a different set of the issues in the countries. So if we cannot make the world with coexistence and the stable situations, I think if there is the trigger, like a war, can make the global the risk factors. So why don't we look at the history to get some lessons?
So you're saying that the situation is not much different from the early 20th centuries. No, I'll give you the chance to make a closing remark about this issue. Okay, so Jessica first, please.
I was going to turn my time over to Greg and Stephen, because I've spoken a lot about gender, so I don't have a very strong view on this. So, yeah.
I certainly don't have a strong view either. I definitely see the possibility that inequality per se can be a systemic factor, like a major risk here. But I would like also to mention that there is also a possibility that for a given level of inequality, what we have seen over time recently is that extreme views have been augmented substantially and have been more effective than before. So in 100 years ago, for a given level of inequality, we wouldn't have heard such extreme views as eloquently. So I think it's a possibility that even with the amount of inequality that we currently have, it would not generate as much systemic risk if that was not coupled with issues about how extreme views are augmented in society. That said, I would also mention that there is a very good reason why you would like to reduce inequality that wouldn't speak to the systemic risk. It would also speak to growth. A lot of people, this is something that a lot of people don't discuss even in economics, but inequality oftentimes harms growth. And this goes back to the idea of innovations that we talked about. This goes back to the ideas of bottlenecks that we were discussing before. There are several reasons why reducing inequality can be extremely efficient in many regards. And even I would like to mention also, and this is a related remark related to the idea of extreme views, is that if we, for instance, are worried about global warming, perhaps it would be a good idea for people not to live paycheck by paycheck, because if you are living paycheck by paycheck, how would you have the attention and the bandwidth to think about global warming? There are many issues in the world that we all care about, but it's oftentimes good for us to realize that we have this luxury good, which is it's okay for us to spend some time thinking about these issues that do not speak to our immediate welfare or our kids' immediate welfare. And like global warming, for instance. It's really, I mean, it is a fact that it's not immediately, as in tomorrow. It might feel extremely important for us all to think about that, but if you ask a family that does not know what she's gonna eat, they're gonna eat tomorrow, they would say, no, that's not what I care about right now. And I think all these issues should be at the forefront of the discussion.
Okay, thank you. Stephen, can you?
Well, the first thing I wanted to say is I think that was an incredibly insightful comment that history unfortunately gives us guides. It's perhaps useful to decompose inequality into inequalities between countries and then within countries. With reference to inequalities between countries, that is obviously a wellspring for the massive movements of people that are occurring with global migration. And we know that there's been enormous issues of proper treatment of refugees, assimilation of people that are admitted, et cetera. And so clearly that could be a source of instabilities within countries or frictions. That said, if I had to make a conjecture, the monopoly of force in this planet is still concentrated in a very few number of countries, and so the idea that war would break out because of it, I don't think it's consistent with the relative military dominance of the United States and China. Now, with reference to looking within countries, this is where the issue of the capacity for damaging beliefs manifests itself, and so you gave the example of the emergence of socialist movements, or, well, I'll be blunt about it, a Bolshevik movement in a particular country, which shifted the 20th century. There, I think maybe a key factor to sort of put on the table is that underlying these spillover effects of inequality is the perception of injustice. In other words, when many people in a society think things are unfair, the institutions are not manifesting their notions of what they ought to receive, that is extremely undermining to procedural democracy. Because if somebody said, well, of course, democracy is the best form of government, of course, I believe that's true. But if it is producing outcomes which are unjust, then that undermines the argument. So you automatically have something that mitigates against the stability of democratic institutions. And then one can compound that with the capacity of economic inequalities, social inequalities, to create scope for a breakdown of solidarity, of fraternity, and the French would say, in a society. But most importantly, the scope for demagogues to use hatred of minorities, hatred of Muslims, hatred of a country that created a shock to economics, et cetera. And that's extremely undermining for stability at two levels. One, it means a policy that the countries themselves are going to, exhibit, drifts towards authoritarianism, but also it breaks down international cooperation. I'm sorry to end this on a note, but obviously in the previous administration, the efforts to treat South Korea as a scapegoat for America's economic woes had a political consequence. It began threatening to the alliance. And so I think that the real danger is that what these inequalities do is they create scope for demagogues to exploit that, and that can spill over to breaking the mechanisms, the networks that create a stable international environment. So I think there's good reason for historical precedent to be worried.
Thank you. Steve made a great wrap-up comments about this for the issue about the global risk, the inequality as a global risk, and then things like you're sort of making similar comments as you're comparing the situation to the early 20th and late 19th centuries, and then it's about the demagogue. It's always an extreme view that really makes the problems. So, okay, thanks a lot. All right, we have about 1 minute, so. By any chance, any floor questions?
I'm going to go back to this education problem. If it's so difficult to fix those problems that we discussed, such as bottleneck and too much competition, children's having some mental problems, then can we try to approach it from the firm side? So if the firms are more profit-oriented, if they think that the people, where I'm heading to is actually people want to go to good premium college because, as Jessica said, the parents are altruistic, so they want to do something good for the kids, and they think they lead to a good job, and they think they can stay there for a long time. I'm talking about the rents from graduating from these prestigious state universities. Then we may approach to firms to more efficiently evaluate their real productivity, not because they got degree from premium universities. Then we may be leaving. I mean, I think we discussed a lot about parents already in the US losing confidence in higher education. I think things are happening. So we maybe put some more effort toward, I know it's politically very sensitive, but we might try to go that route so that there is less rent to be exploited. Then parents may be less enthusiastic about pouring so much money into private tutoring and so forth. So what do you guys think about what kind of political costs that we have to bear to go that route?
It's very good suggestions. I totally agree with you. My discussion previously is very same with your suggestions. I will take an example. In Korea, there is the private tutoring and the private education issues is quite concentrated on the medical school. It is because the medical school has lots of rent over time because the supply of doctor is very limited by government for over the last 20 or 30 years. But the population aging that make the lots of demand for the medical services. So it causes the surge in the rent among the medical schools. So parents want to send their children to good medical school to get the very nice job in the futures. So if we can reduce the rent, maybe it can fix the competition in the case of the medical schools. So there is a hot issues in Korea because of the limited supply of the doctors. The government want to increase the supply of doctors, but there is the big against for the policy from the doctors, the communities, because they can lose the rent. So it might be useful ideas to reduce the rent in the labor market that can improve the competition issues and the private education issues.
That reminds me just Friedman remedy, getting rid of the medical licenses.
I'll also add to this the fact that if we learn something from models of discrimination from Gary Becker, as we increase competition, we might reduce a little bit the discrimination as well.
I don't want to end on a radical suggestion, but I think accompanying sort of Yusun's suggestion, could also be, something along the lines of like, once you get into, a group, a sufficiently large group of people that could be, sort of in a good position to be able to benefit or, to acquire the kind of skills that's required to do certain things. Maybe sometimes we just have to take choice or the perception that you are able to control the outcome of the equation, right? So this is probably something that people will not like. Right, but the same set of policies that we try to apply, like the equalization policy that Korea has at the lower levels, maybe something along those lines, even at the upper levels, might make sense. So if you score above a certain threshold, there's some sort of balloting that goes on to see which major, conditional on you wanting to get that major to get in, and then to try to kind of reduce the disparities across the majors in terms of or reduce the disparities across colleges in terms of exactly what you might be able to get in. But again, these I think are radical ideas. I think Yusun's idea was a radical one. I think these are the I think given sort of the where we are at at this sort of education rat race, I think one needs to think about some sort of policies that really shift our priors on like how we allocate people, how we screen people. Yeah.
Okay. I think I know why Stephen has nothing to talk about this, because in the US, this is no problem at all. But in Korea, the firms are not allowed to fire workers. So evaluating evaluating the workers after they get in has no really meaning because they cannot fire them. So they are actually spending a lot of money in screening the job applicants, and that's what's going on in Korea. And also they use this which school they went as some sort of signal for their quality, and that is creating rents. So what I'm trying to say is that it's not just the educational policy. All kinds of government intervention in creating rents in every aspect of the economy, and that actually leads to greater extent of inequality in society. Anyway, okay, I wish I could sort of could have answered to your question. Okay, I think it is time to wrap up the whole discussion because we had a great discussion, and I wish everybody have enjoyed the discussion. The issue of inequality and mobility are too wide and diverse, and so 2 hours is just by no means enough time for us. So probably we'll have to keep working together on these issues and also enhance our understandings, and maybe get together again and share our ideas and new results. And I'd like to have that opportunity sooner or later. Okay, I wish to extend my gratitude to the presenters and the 4 panelists, and also special gratitude to the audience and also to the Che Institute to for helping us to prepare and make this occasion possible. Thanks a lot.